Welcome to the Femap version 11.3 What's New video series.
Meshing. Just a little bit of history. When we first wrote the quad mesher in Femap, engineers at that point, they wanted almost perfectly shaped quadrilaterals, and if you couldn't get that, they'd take a triangle. So the original mesher was really designed to mesh very perpendicular and create, almost square elements, and then when it couldn't do that, give you a triangle. We have customers now that, I don't know if the analysis codes are changed or just they want to mesh. They want all quads no matter what. So we looked at a couple different ways of doing this, but what we were able to do is take the existing mesher, and we wrote some code that actually a real high-speed data structure. It knows the connections in the mesh, and we just run around and move the triangles around and connect them up and do stuff, and we can just basically take them out of the mesh. So here's the default mesh, and if you don't turn on the max quads, this is what you still get. You turn on the max quads, it just takes those triangles out, and since there's an odd number on the periphery here, you have to have at least one triangle. But then if you change that to one mesh size, you can get an all quad mesh. So it just if you want an all quad mesh now, you can get one. So here's that exact same part, and I'll do mesh surface. I'm not going to let it just remesh and resize right now, but here's the default mesh. And if I go under elements by shape, I can turn on the highlighter and see there's 8 triangles in there. So there's 8 triangles in there. All you got to do is turn on max quads, pick it again, and now there's 4 triangles. Now, it still honors the maximum aspect ratio. So as long as you tune that up a little bit, you can then go to no quads at all. Turn up. And if you change the mesh size, let's just see what it does here. A couple triangles. But again, those are along the same thing. If you allow it to get a little looser on what it'll take as a quad, you can get all quads. Now you can combine this with the layers and get a real nice layer around the edges and then an all quad mesh. And if you keep juicing up the layers, you can do some other fun things where you run the layering in a little bit more. But you can get just about any mesh you want. They're all quads if you want them now. The layers actually tells the mesher to pave one almost perfect layer around the edge. And I told it now 10, so it keeps trying to pave in. Once it gets close to something, it stops. And then anything left over gets the free mesh. Another thing we did, if you used our triangle mesher always had a great growth thing, so when you're tet meshing something, you could tell it, I want a tight mesh around any boundaries or periphery, and then let the mesh grow out towards the middle where there's no stress concentrations anyway. The quad mesher didn't do that. The quad mesher was kind of constant across the mesh. It wouldn't grow in the middle. We've now turned on the grow in the middle for the quad. So you can now achieve kind of that same effect where you go ahead and tighten up a lot around stress concentrations and such, but let the mesh grow further out and get your node, degree of freedom count down for the model. So that'll help get models smaller and better answers. We've also come up with a new smoothing algorithm. Our old smoother does a great job if your geometry, your mesh isn't super curved. But where it was curved, sometimes the smoothing would cause it to relax, and it's just it was like a relaxation thing, the smoothing, so it would kind of droop. We recoded that with a new, more 3D algorithm, so you now get a better smoothing of meshes on highly curved structures. So let's say you're given this mesh, there's no geometry, and for some reason you want to model some stress concentration here and maybe get some better stress data. It'll be a lot of work to kind of make this happen and just regular manual meshing or whatever. So George wrote editing element refine. And it's as easy as you just pick a couple elements, and this is a preview, it's not doing it yet. And you can grow that selection. And when you're done growing that, you hit OK, and you've got a refined mesh. And I'll do it again. I think I picked one down on the inside. It's got to add and remove too. So if you didn't like what you picked, I can remove like that one, and I can now grow it. Now the real neat thing that you don't know is going on here, and I'll show you when I turn on the shrink. There was beam little stiffeners around this model. It's splitting every stiffener It's propagating pressure loads. It's propagating, like you had a laminate definition, the material angle for the split elements matches the one that was the original element. Constraints, if there was a constraint between the two nodes and they're same, it would put a new one in the middle node. So you can now pretty much refine meshes instantaneously. And there's still, I just want to make sure everyone's seen it, back in 11.2, we had another one that is also just handy. Under that same place, there's a mesh editing edge split, and you can just pick two nodes, and it runs through the model and does the same thing. But it propagates it as far as it has to keep everything connected. So you can pretty quickly refine a mesh with these tools. And this one in version 11.3, we added a multi-pick too. So if you were kind of doing that, multiple nodes, you can now pick multiple. It'll go through and do them at one time. And this does the same thing, splits the beam, properties, pressures, constraints, anything. Just another quick example, T-junctions, whatever's connected is going to stay connected. It gets it all done. So in the same model, similar to the plane model there, you pick a region, grow it out wherever you want to. And there's also just a drag. You can just wing the mouse around and highlight elements and refine. If there is geometry, if it's just an orphan mesh, it doesn't do any projecting or anything. But if it does have geometry, it will project and keep everything smooth. So you can quickly do some real nice mesh refinements. Another enhancement we did in this release, we've always had these mesh hard points in the surface. So this part originally, it's a mid-surface thing, and it had some holes. We turned the holes into points so that the mesh would get a node right where you need to constrain it. And if you meshed it, you got a node everywhere you had a point. We had an issue. Then if you used our meshing toolbox to split this up and do other things to get a better mesh in certain areas, those hard points, sometimes you'd split a surface in half, and the point that was pointing to the one surface is now pointing to a different surface. Now if you make any edits and stuff, the points automatically get reassociated to the new stuff, and when you remesh, your hard points are still going to be there. It's just much better when you're using that tool. Another thing we've been working on in Femap, we added kind of virtual geometry or topology on top of solids, but a lot of times we get these parts in that have kind of extraneous points and stuff, and sometimes even extraneous little sliver surfaces and such, which when we go to mesh, we take every little piece into account, we mesh those. Sometimes you get little sliver elements. And we had tools in Femap where you could combine them together into a virtual surface and would mesh on top of that, and you get a much better mesh. So it gets rid of all the little gaps and slivers. But it really wasn't fixing the geometry. So for another customer, we now can actually take those points out permanently at a parasolid level and clean up the geometry and take out edges so you get a continuous new surface. The nice thing here, it does the same end result at meshing, but at least now you get a nice single piece of consistent geometry. You could use it for other splits in Femap, or you could kick it out to another program if you needed to use it for something else. But if you're running into dirty geometry like this, it's just another tool in your toolbox to kind of clean that stuff up and make really good meshes.